It was late afternoon when the sky over Northern California turned blood red. The air was thick with smoke, carrying the bitter scent of burning earth. The crackling of trees collapsing blended with the thumping of helicopters circling above. In the chaos of sirens and shouted evacuations, a lone shadow moved against the tide of fire. A German shepherd, her body trembling, her eyes wide with purpose. She wasn't alone, at least not entirely. 3 tiny puppies stumbled close behind her, while a 4th dangled gently from her mouth, protected as if it were the last living thing that mattered. The flames danced around them, mocking her courage, but still she pressed forward. The ground sizzled beneath her paws, glowing with embers, while the heat wrapped around her like a noose. Every step she took required a strength beyond anything natural, but something stronger pushed her forward. Instinct. Love. The terrifying possibility of losing everything she had just brought into this world. Her name was Maya, a 3-year-old German shepherd, once abandoned at a rundown kennel. Months earlier, she had been taken in by Walter Briggs, a retired widower and former firefighter who had long lived in silence after losing his wife. Walter wasn't a man of many words, but in Maya's quiet presence, something in him had begun to heal. He never imagined that the same dog would one day perform an act of heroism that would leave people speechless. But that day, Walter was gone. He had rushed off to warn neighbors as the wildfire ripped through the countryside. By the time he returned, the road home was blocked by flames, and all he could hear was a faint, desperate barking deep in the woods. Maya was still in there with her puppies, and time was running out. The forest groaned under the weight of destruction. Sparks rained down from above like fiery snow. The puppies whimpered, their tiny bodies too fragile for such terror. Over and over, Maya turned back into the fire, carrying each pup one by one through the blaze, even as her own skin blistered. There was something in her eyes. Fear, yes, but also something else. A fierce determination, a belief that no one else was coming, that she was the only one standing between life and loss. The forest was collapsing. The fire showed no mercy, and Maya, battered and alone, stood against the impossible. But what she would do next would change everything. The wildfire had started nearly 20 miles away, a result of downed power lines and a summer that had stretched on without rain. But no one could have predicted how fast it would spread. By the time the morning sun rose over the hills of Northern California, the sky had already turned a strange, coppery hue. Walter Briggs, like many in the area, had been watching the reports but didn't feel the urgency just yet. At 72, he'd lived through enough fires to know when it was time to run, and this, he thought, wasn't that. He was wrong. The fire was faster than any he remembered. It was unpredictable, angry. By mid-morning, the winds shifted, and in less than an hour, the flames were at his doorstep. Walter had rushed out in his old Ford pickup, determined to alert neighbors along the ridge. He drove with the window down, yelling through smoke-thick air, pounding on doors, waving his arms at panicked families who hadn't yet realized how close death had come. He thought he had done the right thing. But when he tried to turn back toward his property, the fire had already cut off the road. A wall of flames separated him from his land, and from Maya. Panic flooded him. He had left her behind, not because he didn't care, but because he assumed she'd follow him, like she always did. He didn't realize that she had something else to protect now. Maya, meanwhile, wasn't pacing or barking or looking for a way to escape. She was inside the barn, surrounded by dry hay and timber, curled around her 4 tiny pups. Their eyes had just opened days before. They were still unsteady on their feet, their tiny legs wobbling, their ears still soft and bent forward. They didn't know fear yet. They didn't understand the strange heat, the smoke creeping in from the cracks in the walls. But Maya did. Her ears were pinned back, nose twitching, eyes darting. She had known danger before. She had lived through hunger, abandonment, even violence. But nothing like this. This was not something she could fight or hide from. This was something she had to outrun. In that moment, something ancient awoke in her. A wild, primal instinct passed down through generations. She didn't think. She moved. First, She nudged the smallest pup gently with her nose, urging him into the corner of the barn where the smoke wasn't as thick. Then she picked him up, his soft whimpers muffled by her jaw, and darted toward the barn door. Outside, the air was suffocating, thick like syrup, and the orange glow of the fire danced across the landscape like something out of a nightmare. The trees were no longer trees, they were torches. Still, she ran. She found a narrow patch of scorched dirt behind the barn, free from direct flame, and set the first puppy down with a lick to his ear before turning back without hesitation. Every second counted now. Her muscles ached. The pads of her feet burned with each step, but she didn't slow. Back inside, the barn was already groaning. The roof beams trembled with heat. Sparks floated in the air like fireflies from hell. She grabbed the second pup, shielding his body with hers as a section of the rafters collapsed behind them. The doorway was barely visible now, clouded with ash and smoke. Her breath came in short, wheezing gasps, but she pushed through, dropped the pup beside his sibling, and once again turned back. There was no hesitation, no pause to consider if she'd survive the next trip. Her mind didn't work in those terms. All she knew was that 2 of her babies were still inside, and no force on earth, not fire, not fear, not even death, was going to stop her from reaching them. By the time Maya reached the barn for the 3rd time, the fire had fully wrapped around the structure like a predator closing its jaws. The wooden siding crackled and popped, spitting embers into the air, and the smoke was now so dense it was nearly impossible to see. Maya coughed, a sharp, choking sound, and blinked through eyes stung by ash. Her chest heaved with each breath. Inside, the last 2 puppies were curled together near the haystack, whimpering, their tiny bodies trembling. One had already stopped crying. His breath was shallow. She could smell the difference. Time was running out. She pushed through the doorway as a beam collapsed behind her, flames licking the walls on both sides. The heat wasn't just unbearable. It was violent, like it was punishing her for every second she stayed. But Maya didn't falter. She reached the 3rd puppy and lifted him in her jaws, her teeth careful not to puncture his fragile skin. As she turned, her back leg gave out. A burning timber had rolled under her paw, and she let out a sharp yelp, almost dropping the pup. But pain wasn't new to her. She limped forward, dragging her leg, ignoring the burn, the heat, the suffocating smoke, and made it outside. She placed the 3rd pup next to the other 2. But when she turned to go back for the last one, she paused. For the first time since the fire began, she hesitated. Her legs shook violently. Her lungs burned. The fur on her back was singed, and open blisters had begun to form on her paws. Every breath now came with a wet, rattling sound. Her body had limits, and she had just crossed them. But inside that barn, her final puppy was still alive, still waiting for her, and that was enough. She stumbled back toward the door, her vision swimming. Flames now curled over the roof, and the barn groaned like it was mourning itself. With each step, she moved slower. Her instincts warred with her body. Her will was unshaken, but her body was beginning to shut down. As she reached the entrance again, a burst of flame exploded near the corner of the structure, sending shards of burning wood flying into the air. One struck her flank, and she crumpled. For a long moment, she didn't move. Miles away, Walter had finally made it to a fire crew checkpoint, begging them to help him reach his home. He was hoarse from shouting, his eyes red from smoke. "My dog," he pleaded. "She's still there with her pups." The firefighter who heard him hesitated. Orders were clear. That zone was under active flame and completely off limits. But something in Walter's voice, the way it cracked with guilt and desperation, made the man turn to his captain. Minutes later, a team of 3 geared up and headed toward the Briggs property, against protocol but led by instinct. The same kind Maya had trusted with everything. Back at the barn, she had managed to lift herself up again. Her breaths came slow, broken. Her 4th puppy still whimpered faintly inside, just beyond a collapsed beam. Maya pulled herself forward, one paw at a time. Her body screamed for rest, Her ears rang with the roar of fire. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. Because motherhood wasn't something she chose, it had chosen her. And in that moment, she was no longer just a dog. She was a guardian, a warrior, a mother fighting to the very edge of life. When the firefighters reached the edge of Walter's property, the sight before them was nothing short of apocalyptic. The barn was nearly swallowed in flames, the roof already collapsed in parts, and embers floated through the air like angry spirits. Walter leapt from the truck before it even stopped, screaming Maya's name into the smoke. He stumbled through the scorched field, coughing, eyes wild, until one of the crew pulled him back. "Let us go in first," the captain shouted, and Walter, helpless, dropped to his knees, praying to a god he hadn't spoken to since his wife died. Inside the collapsing barn, Maya was down again. Her vision blurred in pulses. Light, dark, light, dark. Each blink slower than the last. Her lungs refused to take in more air, and her legs no longer obeyed her. But she could still hear it. The faint, gasping whine of her final puppy. That sound pierced through the noise of the fire, through the pain, through everything. It was a cry for her, a final plea, and somehow, through sheer force of will, Maya rose. Not fast, not strong, but enough. She limped forward, her belly nearly scraping the hot ground. The fourth pup was trapped under part of a broken beam, not crushed, but pinned. His tiny legs kicked in panic. Maya reached him, nudged the beam with her snout, whimpering softly. It didn't budge. Her breathing now came in loud, rattling gulps, and every movement burned. She tried again, digging beneath the beam with blistered paws, ignoring the sparks that landed on her back like drops of molten rain. And finally, the beam shifted just enough. She pulled the pup out with her teeth and, with the last ounce of strength left in her, turned toward the doorway. That's when the barn gave its final warning. A low groan, followed by a deafening crack as part of the upper frame began to collapse. Maya didn't run. She couldn't. She shielded the puppy with her body, curling around him as the world crashed down. Fire and debris fell around them, and for a terrifying moment, everything went still. Outside, Walter heard the sound and screamed. One of the firefighters rushed forward through the smoke, disobeying orders, his boots sinking into ash and rubble. Through the flames, the firefighter saw her. A flash of black and tan fur, barely moving. Maya had made it just past the threshold of the barn, lying half-covered in ash and debris, the puppy beneath her, alive but silent. The man scooped them both into his arms and ran. Behind him, the barn let out a final roar and collapsed entirely, sending sparks and cinders into the sky like fireworks. Walter ran to meet them, falling to the ground as Maya was laid at his feet. She was unconscious, barely breathing. Her side was burned raw, and her paws were shredded. But her eyes fluttered open, just enough to see Walter's face, and then closed again. The firefighter looked down at the bundle in his arms and whispered, "She saved them all." Walter's throat clenched as he nodded, unable to speak. Around him, the fire still burned, but in his arms lay the quiet miracle of a dog who had faced death 4 times and refused to leave any child behind. The veterinary clinic was nearly 2 towns over, and Walter had driven like a man possessed. He kept glancing into the rearview mirror where Maya lay wrapped in a heavy wool blanket, her breathing shallow, her muzzle streaked with soot. The 4 puppies were nestled against her, unaware of the horror they had just survived. One of them squeaked softly, and Walter's eyes filled with tears. "Hang in there, girl," he whispered, voice cracking. "You didn't come this far for nothing." The vet on duty, Dr. Emily Rourke, had never seen anything like it. When Walter burst through the door carrying Maya in his arms like she was a wounded soldier, people in the waiting room gasped. Her fur was singed to the skin. Her paw pads were blackened. But what stunned Emily most was Maya's heartbeat. It was there, but weak, almost a whisper. The puppies, miraculously, were all in stable condition. "She's a fighter," Emily said, placing an oxygen mask over Maya's snout. "But we need to be fast. She's on the edge." For the next 48 hours, Maya clung to life. She was given 4 fluids, antibiotics, and pain meds. Her burns were dressed daily, and volunteers took turns sleeping beside her cage, so she wouldn't be alone if she woke. Walter refused to leave the clinic. He sat by her side, talking to her even when she couldn't hear him. He told her about his wife, about how he never thought he'd love anything again. He whispered promises, apologies, prayers. The staff watched in silence, moved by the old man's devotion to a dog who had already given more than anyone could ever ask. On the 3rd day, just before sunrise, Maya opened her eyes. She didn't move much, just shifted slightly, enough to nudge the towel beside her. Her breathing was stronger now, more rhythmic. And when Walter reached through the bars and touched her paw, her tail gave the faintest thump against the bedding. "There you are," he whispered, tears slipping down his cheeks. "You came back." He pressed his forehead to the cold metal of the cage door, closing his eyes as the wave of relief crashed over him. The puppies had already started exploring their pen by then. Playful, clumsy, full of life. Emily noted that one of them, the smallest, never strayed too far from Maya's side. He'd curl up near her belly, even when she was too weak to respond. That pup would grow into the strongest of the litter. They named him Ash, in honor of the fire that nearly claimed them all, and the courage that carried them through it. Maya's recovery was long, but steady. Her fur would never fully grow back over the scars, and she'd walk with a limp for the rest of her life. But none of that mattered. What she had done, what she had endured, had transformed her into something more than a dog. She became a symbol, a story passed from neighbor to neighbor, a tale of devotion and impossible strength. Walter often said she had saved more than just her pups that day. "She saved me," he'd whisper, every time he looked into her eyes. Months passed, and the land slowly began to heal. What had once been blackened and charred was now dotted with the first signs of green. New grass, young shoots, and wildflowers pushing bravely through the scorched earth. Nature, it seemed, was determined to start over. And so was Walter. He rebuilt the barn, not as it was before, but as something better. At the entrance, he placed a wooden sign carved by hand. It read, "Maya's Watch." Maya never left his side. Though her movements were slower and more deliberate, her spirit never dimmed. Every morning, she would limp alongside Walter during his walk across the pasture. The puppies had grown strong and playful, romping through the grass, chasing butterflies and one another. Ash, the smallest, remained fiercely attached to his mother, mirroring her every move. Visitors who came to hear the story were often surprised by how quiet Maya was. She didn't need to bark or beg for attention. Her eyes said everything. Walter began receiving letters. First from neighbors, then strangers, then people from other states. Someone had shared the story online and it spread like wildfire. But this time, the kind that warmed instead of destroyed. Messages came from firefighters, mothers, veterans, even children. They all said the same thing. "Maya reminded me of something I forgot. Courage, loyalty, love that doesn't flinch even in the face of death." One morning, Walter sat on the porch, Maya resting beside him, her head on his boot. He sipped his coffee and looked out over the valley, now green again. "You know," he said softly, "I thought my life ended the day Carol passed." He paused, reaching down to stroke Maya's ears. "But then you showed up, and you gave me a reason to wake up again." Maya opened one eye, tail twitching once, as if she understood every word. In the years that followed, Maya aged gracefully. Her scars faded to pale patches, reminders of a war she had survived. Walter often said she carried the soul of something ancient, like she wasn't just born, but sent. A protector, a witness, a teacher. Her story became more than just a tale of survival. It became a message that even in the darkest hour, love can light the way home. And when Maya's final day came, years later, she didn't go alone. She lay beneath the old oak tree behind the barn, surrounded by her grown pups and the man whose life she had quietly saved. Walter held her head in his lap, tears slipping down his weathered cheeks as he whispered, "You did good, girl. You did so good." And as the wind passed gently through the fields, carrying with it the scent of ash and wildflowers, it felt like the earth itself paused to honor the soul of a mother, a hero, and a friend. After Maya's passing, Walter didn't speak much for days. The silence around the house was heavy, almost sacred. Even the puppies, now fully grown, moved more slowly, sensing the weight in the air. Ash, in particular, lingered around the old oak tree where his mother had taken her final breath, curling up in the same spot she had laid. Walter watched him from the porch each evening, hand resting on a cane now, and wondered how something so small could carry so much of her spirit. But grief has a way of making space for something new. 1 week after Maya's death, Walter received a call from the local elementary school. The principal had heard the story, like so many others, and asked if he would be willing to bring Ash and share Maya's journey with the children. Walter hesitated at first. He didn't see himself as a storyteller, but something in his chest stirred. Maybe this was what Maya would have wanted, for others to learn not from the pain, but from the love that survived it. That day at the school became the first of many. Walter, with Ash beside him, began speaking to classrooms, church groups, firehouse teams, and even nursing homes. Each time, he brought with him a framed photo of Maya taken months before the fire. Strong, proud, and gentle-eyed, he told the story not as a tragedy, but as a testament to loyalty and courage. And always, at the end, he'd kneel beside Ash, rest a hand on his back, and say, "Her spirit lives in him now." Word continued to spread, and eventually, a local animal rescue organization partnered with Walter to create the Maya Project. The initiative focused on training and supporting dogs rescued from wildfires and traumatic situations, helping them become therapy animals for people who had also endured loss or trauma. Ash became the program's first certified companion dog. The bond he formed with veterans and children was something close to magic, quiet, healing, patient. Every year, on the anniversary of the fire, people gathered at Walter's ranch. Survivors, firefighters, neighbors, strangers. They came with candles, with stories, with dogs of their own. Under the oak tree, now marked with a simple stone bearing Maya's name, they stood in silence. And then Walter would speak. Not loudly, not with drama, just a quiet retelling of a mother who walked through fire because her love refused to burn out. And in that gathering, with the stars rising over the rebuilt barn, there was always one moment of stillness, a collective breath held between hearts that remembered. Because Maya wasn't just a dog. She was a lesson, a legacy, a reminder that sometimes the greatest heroes don't wear uniforms or speak in words. They walk on 4 legs, leave paw prints in ash, and carry the world in their jaws. Months after the first memorial beneath the oak tree, Walter received a letter postmarked from New York. It was from a national news producer who had seen a video clip of his school visit circulating online. Attached was a copy of an essay written by a 9-year-old boy titled, "The Dog Who Walked Through Fire for Love." The piece had been shared thousands of times, touching hearts across the country. The producer asked for permission to film a feature segment on Maya and the impact of her story. Walter hesitated. He never sought attention. But later that night, sitting under the stars near Maya's grave, he gently rested a hand on her memorial stone and whispered, "Let's tell them who you were." The story aired the following week on national television. It wasn't flashy. It was slow, respectful, and honest. It showed black and white photos of the burned barn, the scorched land, Maya's bandaged paws, and finally, her eyes. That soft, steady gaze that seemed to understand more than words could say. Walter spoke calmly, never dramatizing the events. But his quiet grief, mixed with deep love and pride, carried more weight than any headline. Viewers across the country wept. Messages flooded the network. Animal shelters saw a surge in adoptions. One woman wrote, "After watching Maya's story, I forgave my sister after 12 years of silence. Because if a dog could risk her life for love, I could risk a phone call." Back in his town, Walter watched the Maya Project grow beyond anything he imagined. The program that started with a single rescued litter now included over a dozen dogs in active training. Veterans, trauma survivors, and children with special needs were matched with canines who had endured their own versions of fire, literal or emotional. Ash, now fully grown and calm as a mountain, led the pack. He had Maya's eyes and her gentle spirit. Walter brought him everywhere. Schools, hospitals, disaster zones, and each time people felt something shift in the room when Ash entered. A quiet kind of peace. The kind only a soul who had been through flames could offer. Walter, now moving a little slower, found his days filled with purpose again. He often said Maya had saved more than her pups. She had rescued him. Every morning, he'd place a hand on the wooden collar mount by the front door, whispering, "We've got work to do today, girl." Grief never left him, but it softened, woven into action and gratitude. His home, once hollow with loss, had become a place of healing. Not just for him, but for others too. And in quiet moments, when the wind brushed through the valley and the oak leaves rustled softly, he felt her near, not gone, just changed. Because Maya's story was no longer just about survival. It had become a symbol, a movement, a quiet reminder that courage isn't loud, and love doesn't need words. It walks on scorched earth, carries life in its jaws, and somehow, against every odd, keeps walking forward. One chilly autumn morning, Walter received an envelope with no return address. Inside was a photograph of a young woman in uniform crouching beside a German shepherd, both of them smiling beneath a dusty desert sun. The note was brief. "I was stationed overseas when I heard about Maya. I named my K9 partner after her. She saved my life last month. Thank you for sharing her with the world." Walter stared at the photo for a long time, his fingers trembling slightly. He hadn't realized that Maya's name had crossed oceans, and now it had saved someone else, just as Maya once had. The story continued to ripple outward in quiet, powerful ways. A high school teacher in Chicago built a lesson plan around Maya's sacrifice, asking students to write essays about selflessness. A firefighter in Montana started a training program for rescue dogs using Maya's story as the emotional foundation. And in a small town in Texas, a father sat with his teenage son, struggling to connect after years of distance. They watched Maya's video together in silence. When it ended, the boy simply said, "I get it now." And that was the beginning of something they hadn't had in a long time: understanding. But perhaps the most surprising connection came when Walter was invited to speak at a national animal welfare conference. Nervous but determined, he took the stage with Ash at his side. What began as a simple retelling of a fire and a dog became something much more. Walter spoke from the heart, about loss, love, and the way a creature without words had taught him how to live again. The audience stood in silence when he finished. Some cried, others closed their eyes. But all of them felt it, that invisible thread connecting them to something pure and unbreakable. After the talk, a man approached Walter backstage. He was quiet, with kind eyes and a firefighter's posture. "I was one of the crew that went into your property that day," he said. Walter's eyes widened. "I carried her out," the man continued, voice tight with memory. "I didn't think she'd make it, but she did. And watching her fight to live, it changed something in me. I left the service 2 years later, and now I train therapy dogs." The two men stood there for a long moment, no words needed, just gratitude and healing. Walter walked out of the building into the cool evening air, Ash trotting beside him. The city lights shimmered in the distance, but he wasn't thinking about cities or speeches or strangers. He was thinking about Maya, about how one brave dog with fire in her eyes had ignited something so much bigger than any of them. A movement, a legacy, a quiet army of hope, walking silently into broken places and leaving them just a little more whole. Years passed quietly, the way they do in places where healing takes root. Walter's hair had gone completely white, and his steps were slower now, but his heart had never felt fuller. Ash, now a senior dog himself, remained faithfully by his side. The two had become local legends, not because they sought it, but because they represented something that people longed to believe in: resilience, loyalty, and the kind of love that doesn't vanish with time. Every spring, the fields around the barn bloomed again, wildflowers pushing through the soil scorched long ago. Life always found a way. The Maya Project had grown into a nationwide network of canine therapy and rescue teams. Hundreds of dogs had been placed with families, trauma survivors, and veterans. In the lobby of the project's new headquarters hung a single framed portrait. Maya standing tall in a field, her eyes fixed on something just beyond the camera. Beneath it, a plaque read, "She didn't run from the fire. She walked through it. For love." Visitors often stood in front of it in silence. Some cried, some smiled, but all of them left changed. Walter spent his remaining years in that same house, under that same oak tree, where everything began and everything ended. He was never alone. Volunteers, friends, and former students often visited. And when asked why he never left or sold the land, Walter would always say, "Because this is sacred ground. She walked here. She saved lives here. That kind of love doesn't belong to the past. It still echoes through the wind." And every so often, when the breeze rustled the leaves just right, he swore he could still hear Maya's paws brushing the grass. On the final day of his life, Walter sat on the porch at sunset, wrapped in his old flannel blanket, Ash lying at his feet. He looked out over the valley, green and full, and smiled. His hand rested gently on Ash's head. "We did good, girl," he whispered, eyes glistening with peace. "We kept your light alive." When the sun finally dipped behind the hills, the sky lit up in soft orange. The color of fire? Yes, but this time, a fire that warmed instead of destroyed. And long after Walter was gone, the story lived on. In every rescued pup, in every child who found hope again, in every old soul who sat beneath an oak tree and remembered. Because some lights never go out. They don't flicker. They don't fade. They just pass from one heart to another, burning quietly, bravely, forever.